Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti, good evening, welcome, bienvenue. No? I have to say that this is the first time I have to venture into French and probably Chinese and other languages. My name is Teresa Fiore, and I'm usually at this podium to welcome people who come here for Italian events. But it's a great, great pleasure because our guest from the UK tonight has given us the pleasure of bringing many languages together. And indeed, tonight's lecture entitled National, Transnational, Translational, Rethinking Italian in a Multilingual Landscape really started as an event supported by the INSERA Chair in Italian and Italian-American Studies, but then the French colleagues, whom I want to say hi to and thank you for being here, embraced the thought of doing it together. So I understand that there are many students from French classes as well as translation classes. And this is really what we're doing in modern languages and literatures at this point, really thinking about the meaning and relevance of languages across borders. And Loredana Polezzi will certainly show you this tonight in terms of circulation of languages, in terms of ability to communicate across borders. I would like to thank, as I usually do, Mr. INSERA, who with his generosity makes it possible for us to have guests coming from far away and staying with us, as is the case for Loredana, for a couple of days, to meet students, to meet colleagues, as part of, again, a very organic way of collaborating across institutions. Special thanks go also to Ashley Espinosa, Chris Boncimino, and Ken Brown. Without the students, all of this would not be possible. I would like to also add that this is actually part of a much larger event, which is called the Week of the Italian Language, which is going on around the world right now. Every year in October, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation presents all kinds of events about Italian language. So we're part of that, and this year actually there is a specific theme that they have chosen that is perfect for our theme this evening. But I really want to emphasize the fact that this evening's event is not just about Italian. And to give you evidence of this, I would like to invite Kathleen Loyson to the podium so she can address you from the point of view of what we have been doing in translation studies on campus and in several languages over time.
Hello. My name is Kathleen Loyson, and as Dr. Fiore just said, I'm Associate Professor of French and Deputy Chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures here at Montclair State. So on behalf of the whole department, and in particular the Italian and French programs, as well as on behalf of the INSERA Chair in Italian and Italian-American Studies at Montclair State, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, the students and the MSU community, for this very exciting event. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Loredana Polezzi. We're so pleased to have you here. The translation landscape at MSU and beyond the walls of MSU has changed in a lot of ways since I first arrived on campus some 18 years ago. At that time, we had undergraduate degrees with concentrations in translation available in our French, Italian, and Spanish programs. We taught some general courses on translation theory and practice, and we offered in-house certificates in these languages. We had some workshops and roundtables, and we were sort of plugging along rather nicely. But since that time, the importance of translation in the world has grown exponentially. And with that growth has come an increased attention on campus to the crucial work that is our responsibility to properly train qualified expert translators in a wide range of languages, combining a world-class liberal arts university education with the hands-on expertise needed to succeed in the fast-growing and fast-moving world of professional translation. Since, as the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics cites, translation and interpreting is one of the fastest-growing fields of the 21st century, and employment for translators and interpreters is expected to grow by 29% by the year 2024, we realized how uniquely positioned we were and could yet become to address this urgent need in our economy and in our society. Demand is already strong for frequently translated languages like Spanish, French, Italian, German, Portuguese, and Russian, and it's growing for other Middle Eastern and Asian languages such as Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Hindi. Moreover, the New York, New Jersey area, with its plethora of multinational businesses and governmental and non-governmental organizations, is one of the world's hotspots for translators and interpreters. When the language departments moved to Conrad Schmidt Hall about 5 years ago, that move came with the addition of a fully dedicated translation lab outfitted with 20 computers and workstations, multiple projector screens, 2 professional interpreting booths, and access to online and print resources of all kinds across the various fields in which professional translators are called upon to translate: business, medicine, the law, the social and physical sciences, government and international relations, media and publishing, and the list continues. We have developed new programs and courses at both the undergraduate and graduate level, and we now offer coursework in translation in Arabic, French, German, Italian, Russian, and Spanish, with expansion into Asian languages such as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean expected in coming years. In French, in addition to our undergraduate BA with a concentration in translation, we now offer a post-BA certificate in professional translation, as well as a full master's degree program in French translation. In Italian, the entire undergraduate curriculum has been revamped in order to place translation studies and the importance of translation at the very center of all our academic inquiries, whether they be in the fields of literature, film, or business. We offer courses on translation theory, the technology of translation and computer-assisted translation, as well as on the broad field of audio-visual translation. And our students benefit from internships and field experiences with a range of institutions, such as the Insena Italian Theater Festival in New York, the Sferisterio Arena in Macerata, Italy, for opera surtitling, the International Rescue Committee in Elizabeth, New Jersey, interpreting for Congolese refugees, the Colony in Crisis project in collaboration with the University of Maryland, in which faculty and students work to translate original 18th century historical documents about the Haitian Revolution from French into Haitian Creole. And most recently, the New York State Unified Court System. We have students interning there in the court system in the state of New York. Earlier this year, we also hosted an international conference on translation pedagogy, sponsored by a Quebec United States University grant program as a joint initiative between MSU and the Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. The conference was an effort to reflect on translation pedagogy and curriculum design, and served as a platform of exchange between experienced faculty in the area of translator education and institutions looking to develop their offerings in translation. It is within this environment of growth and change that we welcome Dr. Pulezzi to MSU this evening. We look forward to learning from you so much more about how we can continue to improve our programs and enhance opportunities in the field of translation for our faculty and our students. Thank you so much for being with us tonight to share your experience and expertise. And if anyone has any questions about translation studies or language studies in general, here at MSU, you can come speak with me, you can speak with Dr. Fiore. I have brochures about all of our many programs, and I'll be available for questions after the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Going back to the original theme that I just mentioned for the week of Italian language, it is l'italiano in rete, le reti per l'italiano. And I have to admit that I have had a hard time in translating it, which was quite ironic for an evening in about translation. So it's Italian and the web. At the same time, rete in Italian means also network, and so there was this, I guess, play on words. And as I was telling before, we are using the Italian language just as a case. This evening could have been, with any other language at the center. And Loredana Polezzi is so fluid and versatile that we'll actually displace Italian all the way through, as you will see. And really, she's going to allow us to enter into the web of interlinguistic connections and mobility. That's another important word you will see tonight that characterize the contemporary world that we live in. Indeed, as she claims, we are all translators. There's a translator hidden in all of us. So out of curiosity, I wanted to ask you, how many languages do we have in the room tonight? Lots of them, but can we hear which ones? Yes?
Macedonian, Bulgarian, Spanish, Italian.
That's a good start. Don't be intimidated.
And English.
Okay, and English. Anything else?
Chinese.
Chinese.
Spanish, English, Chinese, Portuguese, French, and a little bit of Russian and Hungarian.
Even people who are between maybe two languages can contribute to this very informal survey. French, that's enough.
Arabic.
Yeah. Arabic. Greek. So that's exactly what we were hoping for. It was not a requirement, but clearly this is a wonderful start precisely to talk about the transnational spaces of communication with languages and across languages that we're going to address tonight. And we hope that these will also remind you how you can start from whatever you already own, whether it comes from family, from traveling, to consider translation without being necessarily overwhelmed by the idea that it's a hyper-technical field that you're not ready for. Here I just wanted to showcase some of our students. They happen to be students of Italian, but you just heard from Dr. Loisen that there are projects of all sorts going on in our department. They have translated for opera. They did audio descriptions. They worked on films, and they've done this through internships. I am sure that if you asked them a few years ago, they had no idea that they would be doing this. And this can be you just 1 year from now, if not even sooner. So with that in mind, I wanted to now introduce Loredana Polezzi, who is at the University of Cardiff, incredibly active as a scholar, as a teacher, as a person who believes in building connections across the world, and you will hear how much she's been traveling. But primarily I want to say that there is a project right now that in a way calls us to rethink very seriously our disciplines, and it is the Transnationalizing project that really tries to amplify and connect languages based on mobility, primarily migration, but all kinds of mobilities. And in this respect, she's really at the forefront of trailblazing thinking along with colleagues in the UK in our discipline. To me, it's incredibly comforting, because at a time in which everybody uses the word crisis when we talk about foreign languages, here we have people who are actually thinking and rethinking in a creative way and connecting people. And so it's definitely a positive message. If you want to learn more about her, the full bio is actually in the sheet that we have circulated. And with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Loredana Polezzi.
Well, it is always embarrassing to stand up after presentations such as that one. Well, let me say first of all, thank you and grazie, and why not diolch? Given that nobody mentioned Welsh, I'll do it. It's a language I don't speak, I'm trying to learn at present. Now, it is a real pleasure being here, and I should say that Professor Teresa Fiore in particular, but Montclair as an institution, have been very, very close to the project that she just mentioned, and I will say a bit more about it. Transnationalizing modern languages, or TML for short. You can see why we went for the acronym. It's far too much of a mouthful. And we see a lot of connections between what is happening in the UK, including the fact that we are in a permanent crisis. I was saying, it's not a permanent revolution any longer, it's a permanent crisis of modern languages, true, but also that there is a real effort to rethink the way in which we motivate what we do, we understand what we do, and also literally the approaches to what we do. But let me start with a statement of fact. We are living in a multilingual world. And I am, of course, today in a multilingual institution. We've just demonstrated it. Teresa asked you how many languages are there in this room, and I'm sure we didn't count all of them. But think about it this way. If you were to ask the person sitting next to you now, what's the probability that they speak more than one language? And you might say, okay, but we're in a room full of linguists, aren't we? So that's it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's not just that. Think of the last 10 people you met on the way here. The 10 people you meet in the morning on the bus, going to work, to uni, to be home in the evening. What is the probability that those people speak more than one language? Think of the linguistic landscapes around you, and that's why I put that picture up there. That's a picture I took in San Francisco, and I'll come to one of the details of it in a minute. But the linguistic landscapes around us, and linguistic landscapes is now an area of linguistics which has been growing exponentially over the past few years, looking at urban landscapes in particular. How many languages do you encounter, again, on your way to university, on your way to work, on a day out in Manhattan, across the water? How many languages can we see in the average American city? So as I said, that's a picture I took in San Francisco, in what used to be one of the Italian-American areas of San Francisco. One bit that I particularly like, I don't know if you can read it, it's there. Gigi's Sottomare Oisteria, fish and pasta. I love that because it encapsulates all the creativity of language, of translation, and of a word that I will be using as I speak tonight, which is translanguaging. You have, of course, the word osteria in Italian, and you have oysters in English, and you end up with an oisteria, which clearly sells fish and oysters, I presume, as well as pasta. So, if you want the data anyway, the real data, well, I opened that up earlier. Let me see if I can get to it quickly. Here we go. Okay, if you want the actual data and if you want precise data, I would highly recommend that you take a look at this. It's as Salzburg Statement, you may know the Salzburg Global Seminars. They are a charitable organization that was founded for peace reasons after the end of the Second World War. It is based in Salzburg. If you ever saw The Sound of Music, it's actually based in the Schloss, in the palace, the castle that you see in The Sound of Music. So lots of people go there because they're fans of the film. I went there to talk about multilingualism. So I was there last December, and on the 21st of February this year, on what is the United Nations Mother Language Day, we launched a statement, and it is called a statement, the Salzburg Statement for a Multilingual World. Now I want to show you this first of all. These are the languages in which we have already published it. And it says that Cornish is in progress, Faroese is in progress, but Welsh is already there, Frisian is there, Galician is there, Hindi is there, and so on and so forth. We felt very strongly that if we were publishing a statement in support of multilingualism, then we shouldn't publish it, you know what, only in English. Nevertheless, if I show you the English version for a second, let's use that one as our lingua franca, why not? Okay, will it open? Yes, it's getting there. Sorry, my computer is doing one of its, I'm updating myself. It's having one of its moments. Okay. The very first statement there, and I don't expect you to read it on the screen, I will read it for you, but you can go and search out for this. The very first statement there, the first thing we wrote on that page is, all 193 United Nations member states and most people are multilingual. That is a fact. It's a fact around the world, and a fact that we often forget. Every single state that is recognized around the world is not one language, one culture, one nation. It's actually made up of people with more than one language. So the question for you and the question for me is, what does this mean? What does the fact, and it is a fact, that we live in a multilingual world, what does this mean for linguists, for students and scholars of languages and cultures, and also for students and scholars of translation? And I will end up saying, also for those people actually who don't spend their lives enjoying the pleasure of studying languages and translation. So, to discuss this, I will draw on a project, the project that has already been mentioned, TML, Transnationalizing Modern Languages, which has taken up, I have to say, most of my life for the last 4 years. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. Sorry, it's a slightly fidgety thing, but we'll get there. Okay. So, TML, or Transnationalizing Modern Languages, it was part of a larger project which was called Translating Cultures, and it was a scheme that was created in the UK by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so by the funding agency of the United Kingdom, in order to support languages and in order to think about how we renew, how we create a field of modern languages, research, teaching, practice, which is fit for the 21st century. Now, as part of that, we proposed this project, which has taken us over the past 4 years, as I was saying, literally from the Orkneys to Tasmania. And also, unexpectedly, I think Orkneys to Tasmania, we'd actually planned for that, believe it or not. But it's also taken us to unexpected places, such as Namibia. And I promise you, there are very few speakers of Italian in Namibia. Our overall aim, modestly stated, has been to change the DNA of modern languages, or if you want, to turn it upside down. I'm sure you know that map. It's the map of the world according to Australians. Okay? So it's turned on its head, it's turned upside down. It's still recognizably our world, we recognize it definitely, but it's not our world as we're used to seeing it. So we've been trying to turn upside down, or if you want, to explode from the inside, the way in which we think about in particular the field of Italian studies as one of the traditional elements, the traditional disciplines or sort of component disciplines of the field of modern languages. How can we rethink that particular discipline, Italian studies, exploding it and exploding with it that silo model of languages, which sees Italian studies here, French studies here, Spanish studies here, and you can carry on, Chinese and Arabic and so on and so forth. In TML, we were thinking about transformation in, the reason why I said DNA is because we were thinking about it as, you know, the molecule of the DNA, the double helix structure. We were thinking about, okay, we're working on Italian as such, and we were doing research, I'll be talking about it a little bit, on Italian around the world, on the mobility of Italian language and of Italian cultures. But in doing that, we were also rethinking the model of modern languages as a whole, rethinking it exactly transnationally, outside that silo. So, our question, our starting question was, if you want, what does it mean to study Italian today? Now, there are two models that we can go for. There is the national model, and that national model is the one on which modern languages as a discipline has been created. It was a creation of the Age of Nations. It was a creation of mostly the 19th and early 20th century. It was modeled, modern languages as a discipline and Italian studies within that, on the teaching and learning of classical languages. But with that idea of a close association between a language, a nation, and a culture. And so what you studied within Italian studies in this particular case was indeed the product of Italian culture over the centuries. Now, if you go for that model, of course, you have the Italian peninsula, upside down somewhere there on that map. You have the Italian peninsula, you have its 16 million, roughly, inhabitants speaking Italian, though not only Italian. And you have, a century and a half, a bit more than that, of unified national life, and a much longer history, of course, of cultural production, going back to the Renaissance, going back, if you wish, all the way to the classical tradition. But that is your limit, if you want. Now, if you're thinking in the transnational model, suddenly what you have is a very global and dynamic map, which encompasses the history of Italy itself, but also the history of Italian migration, the emigration of Italians all over the world, including, of course, here to the US, to New Jersey. It is also the history of colonialism, a history that Italy entered quite late, but nevertheless did enter. It's a history not only of emigration, but also of return migration, of circular and complex routes. And today also a history of immigration, including the crucial role played by Italy, and sometimes with huge reluctance and at times, as is the case at present, with blatantly racist attitudes, but the role played by Italy in the Mediterranean and in the crossings of Mediterranean, which have become a collective and dramatic history of our days. Now, the two models, the national and the transnational, I should say straight away, are not antithetic and are not exclusive. They are, on the contrary, complementary, as in the upside map of the world. The reason why we recognize that map instantly is because we know the other one, because we can still recognize the other one in this one. So when we think transnationally, we're not cancelling, deleting the national. On the contrary, we're thinking about both of them at the same time. We're holding those two dimensions together in tension. Understanding our world with its growing globalization and its resurgent nationalisms is precisely understanding the tension between the national and the transnational. The two models also have a parallel in terms of languages and linguistic identities. On the one hand, the image of a homogeneous national language, and on the other, that of multilingual, I prefer polylingual personally, but let's say multilingual, which is probably the most common word. A multilingual model of the nation. A multilingual model which, remember, is always both internal and external. One thing you will not hear me say or use is the label foreign languages. Languages are not foreign. Languages are always already here inside the nation. You don't have to go abroad to encounter another language. And in the case of Italy, of course, you have dialects. Do you know that the famous definition, the best definition ever of the difference between a dialect and a language? Does anybody know it? Yes? What is it?
Dialect is a language with an army and a navy.
Okay. An army and a navy, or my favorite version is an army and a foreign policy. But there you go. Okay, so what's the difference between dialect and a language and a national language? Well, it has been endorsed, it has been made official. It is, it has the power of the state and possibly an army and a navy and a foreign policy behind it. So, okay. That difference is already inscribed, as I said, within Italy. Dialects, linguistic minorities, of course, across the peninsula. And today also translingual writers of various kinds, born in Italy within those linguistic minorities or migrating towards Italy through other routes, and all kinds of incoming diversity. So Italy has always been and continues to be a rich multilingual space, and also a space of translation. Now, I want to make a very quick sort of theoretical, methodological, conceptual, whatever you want to call it, detour, before I come to my examples and hopefully to also some fun. I need to talk first about a few definitions and the way in which I'm using some terms, in particular mobility, language and translation, and their intersections. That's for later. Let's stay on this map. Traditionally, forms of human mobility have been understood as separate and have been studied under different disciplines. So migration here, translation here, and so on and so forth. But boundaries are shifting in disciplines as well as in human mobilities in reality out there in the world. In 2006, in a famous article, Hannan, Scheller and Urey identified what they called a mobility turn, spreading into and transforming the social sciences. But I would say that since then, it has also transformed, to a large extent, the humanities. And they noted that the concept of mobilities encompasses both the large-scale movements of people, objects, capital and information across the world, and the more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public space, and the travel of material things within everyday life. So all the things that Kathleen was talking about, from the big information networks that we have to our everyday life and the way in which we encounter mobility on the ground. All of these mobilities are also entangled with linguistic phenomena and form multinodal webs, those webs again, okay, networks, webs, which are relational and are performative, and which make little sense if we try to interpret them in terms of traditional, atomized, discipline-bound models and methods, all through rigid binomials such as monolingualism on one side and multilingualism on the other. After all, mono and multilingualism, as David Gramling, a colleague in Arizona, has noted, are part of the same logic, that silo logic. You have someone who's a monolingual, and then they learn another language and they become multilingual, but effectively they have one language, another language, side by side, as self-contained, isolated elements. Today, in fact, it is probably more accurate to talk about what Yildiz has called, Yasmin Yildiz has called, the post-monolingual condition, a condition in which languages are much more fluid, and that silos model, that self-contained model, is really leaking very much on all sides. So within the TML project, we have been asking what happens if we see multiple forms of mobility, including migration, translation, and other multilingual practices, as deeply connected phenomena involving multiple agencies and engaging both individuals and communities in the creation of complex knowledge, affect, and memory networks. So instead of assuming monolingualism and monolingual speakers as the model and the norm, and also, if you think about it, as the ideal product of modern languages, of language education, we have instead focused focus on multilingual practices in a mobile world. This means that instead of the homogeneity of cultures and of linguistic as well as broadly cultural practices, what comes into focus is the complexity of the cultural processes and practices which permeate contexts of social, geographic and linguistic mobility, as well as their ubiquity. And this, in turn, means exposing or recognizing, whichever of those words you like best, that processes of linguistic and cultural translation and also self-translation are the norm, not the exception. Now, I should add here that for me, linguists are not just people who can speak multiple languages. So, those 5 or more that we were hearing about a moment ago. What is the real specialism of a linguist? And by that I don't mean just someone with a degree in modern languages, but someone who is a linguist, who is a skilled user of languages, is the ability to move between them. Translation, understood as that ability to move between languages in all the forms which that mobility takes, is the key skill, the key ability, the constitutive characteristic of multilingual individuals and multilingual communities. What that nexus between mobility and translation points towards is what I call then the translational fabric of texts, but also of experiences. Think about how many of the texts that we read, but also the conversation that we have, would simply not exist if it weren't for processes of translation, whether implicit or explicit. That is, processes which can be built into communication from the start, or inserted sequentially, a posteriori, in individual but also in multiple shifts between and among languages and language variants. So not just something that happens because here there's a text that someone wrote and now I decide to translate it, but in everyday practices, how many times you pick up the instructions for a piece of equipment, and in how many languages is it written? And is it easy for you to decide which one was the original language in which it was written? You may think it is easy, but when you start looking, it isn't necessarily that obvious, for instance. Translation then, defined as this kind of set of practices, foregrounds complexity, contiguity, diversity, and points towards continuities between practices of interlingual translation, the movement between a language and another, but also self-translation, translanguaging, the mixing of languages in much, much more fluid forms than perhaps also what we used to call code switching, where you drop a word into a sentence which is in another language. Translanguaging is what I do all the time, to be honest. Is what Therese and I have been doing for the last 2 days as we were talking to each other. Dropping in and out of shared languages in a very creative and individual way. So let me give you indeed some example of what this means in practice, and in particular connecting this with Italian languages and cultures. And I will use examples from popular music, from translingual writing and from the visual arts. But as I said, we could look at product localization and the way in which that also uses these multiple strategies. We could look at everyday conversations as they are recorded, and I have colleagues who do exactly that, in places from libraries to sports centers and the like. So, popular music. Now, one of the things that I have to say this, one of the things that really struck me when I saw the poster for today, and I saw that we were in the Feliciano building. Now, that was quite inspirational to me, but also quite discombobulating, if that word exists in American English. I often also, say things which are very British, not being British, of course, being Italian. And so the other day I said bonkers, and someone American looked at me and said, "We don't use that word, but I do understand what you're talking about." Now, if I say Feliciano, the first thing that comes to mind for me is José Feliciano, the Puerto Rican singer, who, by the way, I grew up in Italy knowing as an American singer, not a Puerto Rican singer. Now, some of you, let me get out of this again for a second, because I opened up a performance. You may know this song. Hopefully, some of you will. me see if I
Stai sulla collina di paese mio che stai sulla collina disteso come un vecchio addormentato la noia, l'abbandono, il niente con la tua malattia paese mio villaggio io vado via.
You might recognize the refrain.
Che sarà, che sarà, che sarà, che sarà della mia vita, chi lo sa, soprattutto.
Tragic, but I'll stop it. Now, I grew up in an Italy in which that song was very famous, but there's something else that you need to know. José Feliciano sang that song in 1971. That was the original recording, by the way. I managed to find it. Well, the TV, of course, recorded to that. At the Festival di Sanremo, which is the most famous festival of Italian popular music, and still continues today. He came second, he didn't win it. That song is a song about immigration. It's about leaving your home and leaving your small town, not a village. Don't call it a village, please. Now, the small town in question, the writer of the song is a guy called Migliacci. And the town that he's talking about is one of the Tuscan hill towns, the one you see there, in a photograph taken by one of my father's best friend, who was himself an Italian-American immigrant. That is my town. That song by José Feliciano, sung by José Feliciano, is about Cortona, which is my hill town. So I'm now speaking in the Feliciano building about popular music and its circulation. And the first thing I thought was, okay, make my point more clear than this. So I'm speaking here actually in a building which is, you know, in a room which makes my point for me and also somehow wants to haunt me with nostalgia about my hometown. But let me give you another example. So the example I want to talk about is the example of Raffaella Carrà. Now, Raffaella Carrà, who some of the people who have any knowledge about Italian in here might have encountered in one way or another, is a really iconic national popular, nazional popolare product of Italian popular culture. Now, nazional popolare is a philosophical term, and it's a historical term, is a concept that was coined by one of the most well-known philosophers of the 20th century in Italy, Antonio Gramsci. But it's also something that is very much there in contemporary Italian culture. Raffaella Carrà is so much a nazional popolare product that she's known as la Raffa Nazionale, the national Raffaella, okay? Now, she started her career in the 60s and 70s as a singer, and one of her very first songs, a very famous one, was a song entitled Tanti auguri, but it's actually known as Com'è bello far l'amore da Trieste in giù. How wonderful it is to make love from Trieste to the bottom. Okay, so even in her own singing, she's somehow iconically representing this idea of the peninsula and national popular culture. Now, in the 70s, she was very much, that is the image of her in the 70s, with that, again, iconic bob, which has not changed much over the years. But she was la ragazza della porta accanto. She was the girl next door. She was very much the good girl. But like every good girl, she also caused a lot of scandal because she would be on television with miniskirts. She, at one point, bared her midriff. Her midriff was the first midriff to be shown on Italian television. Actually, no, it was the first Italian midriff. There have been other Italian belly buttons, but they belonged to women who were not Italian. Okay, this was the first Italian belly button to be shown. And it was shown in a famous dance, which was known as the tuca tuca, which is a play on touch, touch. Okay, and it was Alberto Sordi, an actor who was the impersonation again of the Italian masculinity of that time, in a kind of comic, but again, nazional popolare way, who was the guy who was dancing with her, and with a finger would go for a belly button like this. And that caused a lot of scandal at the time. But Carà del Nazional Popolare product, Carà de Ragazza della Porta Accanto, the Raffa Nazionale, was also someone who imported or helped to import a lot of transnational, international models, styles, concepts, and aesthetics into Italy. I want to show you a bit of this, but when I show this, I always say, please do not do this at home. I tried, and my neck almost went. So whatever you do, don't try this. This is Raffaella Carrà, again, we're in the 1970s, we're on national Italian television, and it's Raffaella Carrà with her full ballet, accompanying Adriano Celentano, another famous icon of Italian popular culture of the time, and someone else who mixed the Italian element very strongly with importing international styles. Now, my question to you is, what language is he singing in? Second question, what does the ballet, the choreography, say to you? Made up English. Completely made up English. All right is the only bit of true English that there is in there. If you look this up online, you will find entire transcriptions that people have attempted to put down of the text, and they're hilarious to read. Have a look, find them. It's called Please and Colonialism and Mancuso, All Right. And as I said, all right is the only bit of English you will find in there. But this is a phenomenal piece of music from the Italian 1970s, the early 1970s. An Italy in which, of course, English was beginning to be the dominant language. It had just started to take over from French in terms of the most studied language. It was starting to be seen as the most prestigious language at that point. But in order to the number of Italians at that time, still today, but certainly at that time, didn't speak a word of English. And what Celentano was doing was importing that aesthetic, importing that sound. He was known also as the molleggiato, the one, you know, the sort of, because of his movement, of the way that he moved. And that too was something that he was imitating from Presley and from others in American music, who in turn had of course picked that up from, in particular, Black American music and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of processes of translation that are going on here. Some of them aesthetic, some of them musical, and some of them linguistic, although the linguistic ones are pseudo-translation. It's actually fake English that you're hearing there. Anything about the ballet, anything that struck you there, in terms of the aesthetics of that? And I could, of course, carry on and show you more of it. And as I said, do not do it at home. At the end, you know, they're literally doing this, and I have to hold my neck if I do it, but it's quite phenomenal. But one of the things that is going on here also, that ballet, at the time, the ballet, the choreography of Raffaella Carrà's ballet troupe was done by an Italian-American. An Italian-American called Don Lurio, who had returned to Italy. He was one of two Italian-Americans who were absolutely extremely popular in Italian television in that period. The other one was Mike Bongiorno, who was the host of TV quizzes. Now, Don Lurio is incredibly interesting because he imported a whole series of aesthetics from blaxploitation to camp into Italy at the time. And if you look at that entire video, you will see that there's a lot actually of camp aesthetic that is going on in that choreography and in the way in which it works. I have a tiny bit here, I can't find the full video of this, but I have a tiny bit here of something else that Don Lurio did with an African-American colleague, Lola Farana, translingual writing. So I was saying earlier, I want to somehow try to break up this notion of translation as purely, here is a text and now we are translating it into another language, source text, target text, and done a posteriori, probably by a professional translator and so on. Now, the case of Shirin Ramzali Fazel is a really interesting one. She was one of the very first writers in Italy She was a pioneer in writing from a post-colonial position and also writing from a post-colonial translingual position. So she's a Somali-born writer who moved to Italy. She's lived all over the world. She lived in Kenya for a while. She's lived in the States as well. But she moved to Italy in the early 1990s and decided to write in Italian. Now, her first book, Lontano da Mogadiscio, is an autobiographical book, but it's not a traditional autobiographical book. It is also not a sociological text. It was a clear attempt to make an intervention in what she considered to be a non-existing dialogue. Growing up in Mogadiscio, Shirin learned not just Somali, but also Italian. She was schooled in the Italian schools there. This was already in post-colonial times. You may know that Italy had a short colonial period from the 1880s to the end of the Second World War, and Somalia was one of the areas occupied by Italy. Shirin was not growing up in occupied Somalia, she was growing up afterwards, but Italian presence was still strong, and there were Italian schools. She learned a lot about Italy. She was in the typical colonial position of someone who's never seen Italy, but has learned about literature, has learned about geography, has seen Italian cinema, and so on. When she arrived in Italy, she somehow expected that to be reciprocated, but this did not happen. And so she started to write in Italian out of disappointment and to an extent also anger. Now, in her book, there are lots of translations. There is the colonial translation, which is being reversed. So, colonial translation typically goes from the center to the colony, and Shirin was trying to reverse that. She was trying to find a voice in Italian as an ex-colonial, as a Somali woman. There's also a process of translation because she had to explain Somalia to an Italian audience. And she was writing in her book, including a lot of Somali words. So she was writing in Italian, but including a lot of Somali words and Somali concepts in her text. What happened next? The first one there, by the way, is the cover of her first book, which is a cover that was imposed on her and she never actually liked at all. She then moved to the UK, following the roots of the Somali diaspora, and in moving to the UK, she started writing, not any longer in Italian, but now in English. And one of the things that she did was to self-translate. So she then produced another version of the book, which is called Far from Mogadiscio, and you see the cover there again. Her retranslation, her self-translation in Far from Mogadiscio, is both a translation and a rewriting at the same time. She included new chapters, which were written now in English and then translated into Italian. And the result of that is that she ended up then publishing a new version of the Italian book, which you also see there, Lontano da Mogadiscio. And then eventually she published what you see there, Lontano da Mogadiscio, Far from Mogadiscio, a bilingual version of the text. What is happening here is very close to what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, has described in his article translated by the author, My Life Between Languages. Or if you want also what authors like Yoko Tawada, who is a Japanese writer who works in German, have described as a process in which you create and you translate at the same time, and writing and translation feed into each other, and it becomes very difficult to distinguish an original from a translation. Somehow, Tawada, for instance, talks about sister texts, texts that are not one the product of the other, but grow organically and in parallel next to each other. She talks about an original and a translation that meet in the middle as a result of two movements in two directions. In Shirin's case, her micro-translation strategies also changed. There are now no footnotes in her book. There were footnotes in the first original version. Now there are no footnotes in her book. Translation is built directly into the text, but very sparingly. She says that for her, the Italian culture and the Somali culture were always mixed. We're always coming together, and the two idioms don't have a border, a linea di confine. She also embeds some Italian into her English. She talks about, for instance, my expensive divano, not my expensive sofa. translation is an updating of the original, but also the creation of new layers of memory and the development of new aspects of the dialogue. Now, not only with an Italian audience, but also addressing a transnational audience, one which speaks English, and also an audience which can deal with multiple and interwoven languages. So here translation becomes what I was trying to describe before, not just a binary model, but rather something which is enmeshed, embedded, built into the process, and which is very difficult to then decouple and take apart. Let me take you to one more step, and I want to show you one little piece of video again, and then we will sort of move on to my final section. Translation, as I have shown you, is not limited to language. It goes through music, it goes through aesthetic codes, it goes through ways in which we build our own story in multiple codes. I've been working quite a lot recently also with visual artists, in particular with visual artists who work on and reflect upon the process and experience of translation. A process and experience of translation which may be their own, but may also be the process and experience of translation of their family. So multigenerational, intergenerational memory of translation. I'll give you two examples here, and I'll talk very briefly about them. One of them is B. Amore. B is a third generation Italian American who works not far from here and has often shown her work in New York. And if you go to her site, you will find in particular a phenomenal exhibition which was held in 7 rooms at Ellis Island, in the location where migrants used to come through, and occupied 7 of those rooms with memories of migration. She works with visual, but she also works with words. She creates, for instance, these things that she calls memory boxes. As you can see, they recall the kind of sacred icons that you can find in families. But she creates these with the photographs of the family and then the words taken from diaries, letters, memories. So these are multilingual texts in which Italian, English, dialect very often, Sicilian, Neapolitan, Tuscan, and so on, cross over, and in which she tries to materialize the memory and experience of translation. Now, another artist who works in a completely different geographical area in Australia is Lucy Calipari Mancuso. And I want to show you just a little bit of her talking about her work. Lucy is, in this case, third generation Italian-Australian. B's family came from Naples. Lucy's comes from Calabria. And what Lucy does is to impersonate, to dress up and reproduce wears the costumes and reproduces the hairdos and the traditional outfits of women in her family. And she produces then pieces of clothing that she calls translations of the experience of migration. I want to show you just a little.
With every stitch, I'm retracing the threads of the past. I'm re-exploring, retracing the threads that my family created when they emigrated to Australia in the 1950s. I am an artist, and I'm here today doing a live art performance and installation called Tracing Threads of the Past, Facendo Fili del Passato, which is the Italian translation. Sewing is a tactile thing. You have to kind of feel your way, and in a way I've been having to work out what language my sewing machine is speaking to me. So,
Okay. That's the bit I wanted to hear you. She's talking about her sewing machine speaking different languages, or deciding what language her sewing machine speaks. She's treating the practices of women in her family, and this is something that has also been studied, of course, in Italian-American families. There's a fantastic book edited by Joe Shora and Dice Giunta on embroidery and sewing as a form of expression of Italian-American women. She's talking about the way in which a sewing machine can become a machine for translation, a way of embodying the memory and the shared experience. Now, one of the interesting things here is that, unbeknownst to each other, Bea and Lucy were working at two sort of ends of the world, one in Australia, one in the US, both of them using these metaphors of threads, il filo rosso della migrazione, and the thread of migration in the sewing machine for Lucy. And both of them thinking about Italy and thinking about migration from Italy without substantially actually touching Italy. The connection between their work is glaring, but it was never made by them. It was made through Italy when we brought both of their work together in an exhibition that we organized in Rome. And for the first time, well, Lucy and Bea did not meet because Lucy was there but Bea could not. But their work was actually set side by side, showing the connections between the two. And at that point, Italy, the absent center of memory and desire in both these artists' work, also became a material place. Now, I've used all of these examples because I want to talk about translation as I said, as something more than just an a posteriori accident, a source text that gets turned into a target text, a source language which gets turned into target language, a source culture that gets turned into target culture. Translation is, for me, much more ingrained, deeply ingrained in what we do. It's part of the DNA of language and of language practices. And this is what I call a new translation continuum, a continuum in which translation, self-translation, multilingualism, translanguaging are part of the way in which we live our lives, our everyday lives, our creative lives. It also is part of what makes us literate, active members of our societies. Now, I want to conclude by talking about what implication this has for us as translators, but also for us as educators and as trainers of translators, and for the way in which we think about educational practices in languages more generally. At present, translation and the ability to move between languages are often banned from our language classes, in the name of communicative teaching and the adherence to maximum exposure to or immersion into the target language. And that exposure, of course, is important, but we also need to put translation back where it belongs, at the center of our teaching and learning practices. The ability to move between languages must be acknowledged as the goal of language learning in a multilingual world. And translation as a form of literacy is a tool as well as a method for understanding our multilingual and mobile world. But we don't only need translation literacy, i.e. the ability to translate. We also need literacy of and about translation. We need more translators, but we also need to understand that translation is not just for translators. Instead, we need a more diffuse sensitization about translation and about what it means to work with translation in a multilingual world. And I want to give you two final examples of this to conclude my talk. The first one is to do with working in Namibia. As I told you, the project took us to places which were unexpected. We went to Namibia to work in a multilingual environment, and there the people we've been working with are not linguists or translators or language trainers and translator trainers, but rather have been working intensively, for instance, with doctors and with trainee doctors. Namibia is a country with 13 official languages, plus English as a national language. Doctors, other professionals are trained increasingly in English, but when they go out there, they have to work in a multilingual world, in a multilingual environment. Initially, when we arrived, the dean of the medical school said to us, okay, we want to find ways to teach all our doctors the languages of Namibia. And we had to say, look, it's impossible. You can't teach them how to be good doctors, and on top of that, 13 languages, and then let alone all the dialects and the local versions of them. But what you can do is sensitize them to what it means to work with translators, to work with interpreters. And at the end of a 3-hour workshop with medical students, I had one of them say to me, okay, this is interesting, I've never thought about it this way. When I go into a medical center, a hospital for my training, and I say I need an interpreter, the words I use exactly are, I need an interpreter because my patient doesn't speak English. This is from someone, remember, for whom English is not a native language. But for someone whose identity, whose professional identity has become so enmeshed with English that they're now thinking in that way. And she said, okay, what does this say about the power relationship between me and my patient? What does it say about the way in which I look at my patient? Effectively, at that point, she had recognized that English was not enough, that English will never be enough, that to live in a multilingual world, she needed to be able to be sensitized to other languages. And we can do this by learning languages, but we can also do this by learning how to work with those who know the languages, with interpreters and with translators. The other example that I want to give you is the one of a MOOC, an online course that we've done, in which we've now taught to about 35,000 people in 182 countries across the world. That MOOC is not aimed at, I want to show you a tiny bit of the kind of things that we do, which are rather crazy at times, but there's a little bit of French in here that I want you to see. So what we do here is not so much teach translation. You can't train translators and interpreters in 4 weeks on the web. It's impossible. But we try to dismantle myths about translation, and we try to sensitize people to what it means to translate and what translation can be. And let me just show you a tiny bit of this, which is in here, and which shows you how far we stretch the idea of translation. I'm sure you know this little poem. Go away. Recognize it? Okay. Now let me show you. Like that. Let me show you what someone has done with this. And is this a translation or not?
Multigenerational by Louis Van appears to be a collection of poems in French. In fact, they are English nursery rhymes as spoken in an outrageous French accent. Here's one. Un petit d'un petit, s'étonne oral. Un petit d'un petit, à degré de fall. Un an qui ne se cesse, un an qui ne se mène, qu'importe un petit d'un petit, tout gai de rien.
Okay, that's just a fun example, but it's one way of stretching the notion of translation beyond what is expected by those who don't understand that translation is not just taking a one word and transporting it somewhere else. So, oops, it's gone to something else. Is it gone? Where is it? Okay, silence. Silence has been achieved. Okay, just to conclude, just to finish that. Okay, what am I trying to say in all this? So, first of all, the kind of learner that we're trying to aim for through translation and through this kind of sensitization will no longer be modeled on a native speaker will no longer be someone who speaks languages always as if they were mother tongue, but will be much more modeled on that multilingual world that I was talking about at the beginning, and on the idea of the self-translator, of the person who can move between languages. This approach also leads us from forms of pedagogy which take it leads us towards forms of pedagogy which take a critical approach to the hegemonic role of English as a lingua franca. As I was saying about Namibia, English is always useful, but English is never enough. And if you think about it, Umberto Eco, the Italian scholar, wrote a fantastic book about this a number of years ago. No language has ever achieved entire global domination, if nothing else because that language starts breaking down into dialects, into other versions before it gets to that point. And so today, for instance, it's much more appropriate to talk about Englishes than it is to talk about English. The experience of languages, plural, of Englishes, plural, is an integral part of our life, even for those who may genuinely think of themselves as having only one language, only one mother tongue. But we need to make this visible and audible, and this is where translation in its multiple forms becomes both a key instrument of knowledge and also an important instrument of sensitization. Rethinking the relationship between translation and literacy, and not just language literacy, but our cultural literacy in general, in a mobile world, has substantial implication for what we do as teachers, as citizens, and as researchers. It means breaking away from rigid binary models and rethinking multilingualism and translation as the normal, and indeed as part of a continuum of the practices we adopt in everyday life. Translation can become a tool and a method, an instrument of research and a way of thinking, of understanding the world. But, and this is my call to action if you want, for translation to become truly visible and central as a form of literacy, and for literacy of translation to become properly diffused, properly known, we need a campaign against language indifference. We need policymakers, we need teachers and also researchers across all areas to start thinking of languages as more than a transparent pane of glass. And this is where I think some of the images of translation and translators are less than useful. We need to understand and press the point that what we do as translators, that when we move between languages, is not just going through a transparent pane of glass. This does not mean that the word is untranslatable. On the contrary, translation, in the many forms it takes along its continuum, is always already here. We just need to pay attention to it.
Much to think about. From popular culture to theory and historical concepts coming from philosophy. Clearly we're dealing with something that is incredibly accessible, but pushes many boundaries. So we're going to stay a little bit longer to take your questions and further discuss these issues. If you want to sit in the center, we're going to ask Kate to the center. So let's hear from the students or from the faculty involved in translation, both in, I guess, the traditional ways, but also as part of this rethinking that Loredana has been describing to us, which is, of course, an ongoing process, right? And it's far from being codified. Do you have any questions, any observations?
Or have I completely bamboozled you?
Yes, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. That was incredibly rich. I mean, to go through so many different levels of popular culture, to give so many examples in different languages. And this idea of everything being self-translated in the end is quite interesting, thinking about a way of getting machine translation in or working with apps. But I'm curious what happens there's no source text, if there's no source text and no native speaker,
Yeah.
when you're in a political situation or something where there might be multiple people listening to multiple people, how are you suggesting the self-translation won't work in that case?
So the question is about self-translation, and we've seen the example of literature, right, which may be better understood, but how does it apply to multilingual contexts?
Yes.
Like the UN.
Sorry.
The UN, for example.
Like the UN. Okay, well, there are two levels here. So to stay for a second on the kind of example that I was using, so for instance, in terms of self-translation of texts such as literary text. I was talking just the other day to a Canadian colleague who was saying that she's working with some Canadian authors, and one of them in particular recently was given the opportunity to produce, so a native Canadian author who was given the opportunity to publish some of his work in his own native language. And the comment that sort of came out of his mouth instantly was, "Oh, fantastic, so now I can finally write the original." As in, I've always had present in my mind the way in which I would have written this if I had been writing it in my native language, but the only opportunity I had was to write it. I think in that case it had been in French, and then it had been translated into English again in Canada, but what was absent was that other element. So it's interesting what is happening there, where, and Gugi said something similar at a certain point, that he was, in his head, there was always a Kikuyu version of what he was doing, but what he was writing down was the English version. Then he started writing the Kikuyu version and asking other people to translate it into English, and then he decided actually to self-translate, but at the point where he started self-translating, he was writing in parallel. He was writing something in Kikuyu, then he was translating into English, and as he was translating into English, he was rewriting the Kikuyu, and so on and so forth. So the process, the creative process was feeding itself. Now, in terms of political context, or in terms of a place like the UN, what is interesting there, I think, is something else, is who decides who is translated, who needs translation, who doesn't need translation, and how translation is used. Now, you can think of the UN, and in the UN there's a certain level of agency by the players themselves, the speakers themselves, but you can also think about asylum-seeking processes, for instance, in which, to what extent someone is allowed to self-translate, or to what extent someone is given the right to an interpreter. Both of those ends of the spectrum are controversial, and then there's everything in between. But we don't have clear practices. And very often it is left to the local level to decide. And very often, of course, we also know that the interpreters that are being used in those contexts are not necessarily, at the UN there will be professional trained interpreters, but in those contexts very often they may not be. So there's a very serious issue here about not just the question of self-translation, but a question of translation as a whole, that continuum I was talking about, from professionally provided translation, to self-translation, to translanguaging, moving between languages and so on. That, and the whole question of human rights, of citizenship, of social cohesion and access to education, of course. The other big point for the work that we were doing in Salzburg, the work we've been doing in Namibia, is to do with the way in which education is provided in multilingual contexts, and whether a dominant language is the only language through which education can be accessed. If you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the underpinning principle, which is the principle, it's called the ethical imperative in UN sort of documentation of no one left behind. The question then of access to education and in what language that access can be provided is paramount. So, yeah, it's a very complex area, but I think it's a complex area which that notion of looking at this as a continuum as opposed to looking at either or can perhaps help because it's too rigid otherwise. And once you've decided also that someone needs a translator, then they've completely relinquished or they've been moved into a space in which they cannot speak unless they are translated. So reinstating some elements of flexibility in there is fundamental, I think.
In literature, by the way, the issue is very much central in these days. Jhumpa Lahiri, who came here a few years ago, has just published a book in Italian. She is living in Italian again right now, and she's actually refused to translate her own work. Yes. And that's an interesting position. So we can also have exactly the opposite, right? The identification with only one version, to the point of not wanting to write anymore in the language you were brought up in. We also had Amara Lapus here a few years ago, who talked about writing in different languages at the same time, and saying exactly what you were illustrating to us, so that every time it's a new creation, right? And it's a multilingual text by definition.
Yeah, Lapus is extremely interesting because he also works with informants. So he very often has people who will advise on different areas of language, because, for instance, he uses Italian dialect, not just standard Italian. And I understand that Amara is also in the process of writing more in English, potentially.
In English, in Arabic
in
now,
Arabic
actually.
as well.
He moved back
so
to
he's
Algeria.
Jhumpa Lahiri, of course, is another very distinct model, in the sense that she made the conscious decision. Sorry, that's my computer again deciding to update something or other. But made the conscious decision of moving into a language which is not her own, i.e. Italian, but a language which she describes as a language of love. And it's really interesting. She's not the only one. There are other writers who have spoken about the sense of freedom that you can also acquire by writing in a language which is not the language in which you were brought up, or also, and this is the case with Lahiri and her own background, or also a language which still has in some way a colonial grip on you, or a historical weight which makes it well, language is never neutral, but certainly less than historically neutral, let's say. So, but in the case of Lahiri, of course, it's also a position of power from which she does that, because she could negotiate that position as someone with a strong voice and a prestigious position, and so she could say, no, here it is, it's in Italian, you want it translated, I'm not translating it, and I'll have a very good translator, thank you very much, doing it, because it was Alan Goldstein who translated it, so, yeah.
I loved the examples you gave that were pertinent to Italian, the way the Italian diaspora spread around the world, but then also how new languages are being imported into Italy, and then the multiplicity of languages within Italy with dialects. And I just was thinking how reproducible that is among so many other linguistic examples. Take the French example, through colonialism and migration, French has spread to every continent on earth, but now there's so much immigration into France and so France is a multilingual landscape, and then French is everywhere, and we also have to speak of Frenches, and there's not only one French, and then the who decides which French version we're teaching in our classrooms, in which, in our American classrooms, where we very often have students from the post-colonial French world, and so it just brings up so many interesting questions with every example of a different language that you take.
Well, Teresa will know this, but as part of that project, one of the things which we hadn't expected, but which was a result of that project, was that we then created a series of texts to which Teresa is contributing,
a series of texts which are for a variety of languages, transnational Italian studies and transnational French studies, and so on and so forth. French is an interesting case because, of course, there is this concept of francophonie, but francophonie is very often still very centripetal. It's still about l'hexagone. It's still about. What is interesting, and one of the interesting things, for instance, working in Africa, working in Namibia, and I am increasingly also talking to colleagues in Zambia, in Uganda, other places, is that there are very few programs, and, you know, this is something, again, going back to the question you were posing, but going back to what are we doing with our practices, with our training practices. There are very few programs that train translators and interpreters in these countries. But where there are, very often, most cases that I know, what they're doing is effectively taking the European model of training translators and of modern languages and moving it to these contexts. So what they will teach is English-French translation or English-Spanish translation. And by the way, not with, you know, say African versions of French, for instance, but very much going back to
that.
And Paris, actually, Paris, if at all possible, And this is problematic because effectively those programs are not particularly popular, but also they're not really providing the people with the skills that are needed in those contexts, where Congolese French or would be much more useful probably, or at least the ability to move between both of those variants, the let's call it more standard version and that. That, of course, is true of a number of the more global languages. So it's true about, I've come here from Lisbon, and so I was there with Portuguese and Brazilian colleagues. And, of course, the tension, again, between Brazilian and Portuguese, and there are reasons why lots of people don't want to talk about lusophonie, the equivalent, the lusophony, because the lusophone area is again, goes back to the empire, goes back to the colonial element. But that tension is very strong. But yes, you can think about Italy is interesting because it never had, if it had an empire, Mussolini's empire lasted less than 10 years, and that's what it was. But it never had that strong colonial expansion, although there was a colonial moment. But those are the other tensions that you then have to put into that pot. Which is quite complex. But the question of what kind of languages we're teaching, what kind of training we're giving to people, what are the useful variants, and of course at the bottom of all this is a question of prestige, and of language prestige and the power of different variants.
I actually teach French, I'll see tomorrow my French language. But my husband is Chilean, and when you talk about there is no, I don't know what the mother tongue of that is. There are 20 Spanish-speaking countries in town. A group of those Spanish speakers, all native and all thinking they speak the right way, sitting and translating anything, poetry in particular, which is what I've sat through, is fascinating because they don't have the same vocabulary at all. No. And sometimes what one says is absolutely not sayable in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Spanish, exactly. Spanish is another one. But that's the point that I was also making, and it's the way in which one can always counter the fallacy about, but English is enough. Well, for one thing, which English? And it's never, there is this utopian dystopian, because it's always been utopian dystopian myth of, whether it's pre-Babylonian or at the other end of history, if you want, only one language. And you can see it as a utopia. The people who see it as utopia are usually the people who are either working on this purely from a technological point of view and without speaking to linguists and without thinking about diversity and culture and all that. Or they are the people who are just thinking about money and they're thinking, if only we could do away with all this expense of translation. Well, there are lots of things that are expensive, and translation actually is an important area in which to spend money because it does something really important, because language, as I was saying, is not a pane of glass. It's not just a transparent filter. You have to have seriously good translation if you want to have good results and if you want to achieve something. But whether you see it as a utopia or a dystopia, effectively, the myth of your universal language is it is what it is. You know, Latin started to break down into the Romance languages, you know, before it reached anything else. English is already breaking down into all kinds of other of versions, and that is the history of our languages. The beauty of our languages is that they are plastic, dynamic, creative. That's the beauty of them. That's what makes them the fantastic instruments we have, because we can always do something new with our languages. The productivity of languages is at the center of it, but it also means that, yes, you know, there's no guarantee. Whereas that, you know, I can speak to plenty of Italians and they just look at me, and I come from Tuscany. Theoretically, you know, again, like your husband and the friends, theoretically, my version of Italian is the version of Italian. And people laugh at what I say, of course.
Any questions?
Actually, it doesn't matter very much which variety of cat or which dialect.
Yeah.
The answer to the question, dialects are different varieties of the same language.
Yeah.
So the choice of a particular type of language depends on who are the readers, right?
Yeah.
On the market. So your project sounds very ambitious. It changes traditional translation theories, right? And transnationalization. The goal is to create a kind of international language.
No, absolutely not. No.
So what do we really mean by transnationalization?
It means trying to think languages and what we do in modern languages much more through this idea of the mobility of language, rather than, okay, let's put it this way. I'm on record saying a number of times, if you want to create another native speaker of French or another native speaker of German or whatever, there are other ways of doing it. But the goal of what we do is not to produce another native speaker. If the goal of learning languages and of teaching languages is to create another native speaker, for one thing, we fail miserably, 99.9% of the time. You know, I'm not a native speaker of English, and I am probably a better speaker of English than an awful lot of native speakers of English in certain situations, in certain conditions, in certain registers, and so on. But that doesn't make me a native speaker of English. For me, what is fundamental and what we're trying to do is say, okay, what is really the key skill of a linguist? It's the ability to move between languages. It's not the fact that I have one language here and one language here and one language here. It's that ability to connect them and to communicate across those languages. So that's the goal, to make us think languages and the way that we train linguists and you know, one, to embed translation more into what we do, but not in the old way in which, you know, you go into a translation class and what you do is what we used to call grammar translation. Here's the vocabulary, here's the grammar, now translate, and here's the correct translation. It's trying to debunk that and to say, well, translation is much, much more capillary, it's much more pervasive in what we do. We need to think about the ability to move between languages and that continuum that I was talking about. So we're not in any way aiming to say what is going to be the lingua franca. As I was saying earlier, I think any lingua franca only takes us this far and then falls apart, because no lingua franca will always be completely homogeneous. And thanks God for that.
Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah.
Linguistically speaking, of course, that movement is always possible. Right? You translate from language A to language B.
Yeah.
So linguistically speaking, it's not deviation.
Yeah.
So you use the term transnationalizing modern languages. It means the mobility is possible, right? Then you apply it into a language, grammar linguist.
Yeah.
Then you say translating cultures.
Mm-hmm.
What's the distinction? The translating cultures, it seems to me, is more difficult, more challenging than the so-called mobility between languages.
Okay. But as a linguist, and we can get into this discussion all the way back to Sapir-Whorf, but as a linguist, would you be able to decouple culture from language?
I will do everything possible to make the translated product accessible to the consumer.
Yes.
But at the same time, try everything possible not to lose the source cultural features.
Exactly. So what you're saying is you can't really, and you don't want to, which is exactly what I would say. For me, it is, it is always the case, and this is proven, by the way, not just by literature, but I mentioned earlier the idea of product localization. Why do we localize products? Well, we localize them because of culture, not because of language. We localize them because culturally, in order for the marketing to be effective, for the positioning in the market, etc., to be effective, we need that repositioning. So it's not just, if you become a literary translator, please remember that. It's if you're doing marketing, you're doing publicity, advertising, you're doing product placement, you will be dealing with these things. So yeah, I fully agree with you. But those two things for me are coupled. And I would never want to decouple them, but also I think it is impossible to totally decouple them. And that is, for me, ultimately why I find it frustrating that people who work in machine translation, in artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, are not speaking to languages and cultures people enough, or indeed to translation people enough, because so much of what has been done has been based on the code, but the code is always layered and inscribed and encrypted with all these other elements. So totally agree. Yeah.
That's why you get the Google Translate songs, Jimmy Fallon's show, because obviously there's culture that interferes, right? And it's not just a problem with the languages.
Sorry.
I know you told me you were from Cortona. I'm from Lazio. Area
I showed you the picture of my town.
Yeah. And since I say things suddenly, like if you take Puglia, Basilicata, Calabria, there was an Albanian influence back in the 1500s. And now today, migrants are going back.
Yeah.
And in many towns, they don't, not only do they speak the Italian, but also the Albanian.
Yeah. No, but of course the Alvarez, which is spoken, for instance, in Calabria and in those areas, is by now quite distant from the modern Albanian. I mean, it has a lot in common, but it also is quite distant because it dates back a number of centuries. But yes, I mean, that's another of the fallacies. And I was saying, you will never hear me talking about foreign languages because effectively, I mean, as an area, of course there are languages, I can say I speak a foreign language at some point, but effectively the languages are already there. They're already, and in the case of Italy, Albanian is one of those languages that have been there for centuries. The question of what languages we speak, and again we proved it in here, but not everybody has only one mother tongue. And so, for instance, in many communities, there are people who grow up bilingual. I have many students who grow up more than bilingual. In Namibia, plenty of those students grow up trilingual, for instance. One of the things that I didn't say, and I should have said, is that I find it very unhelpful that we continue to use a language. When we talk about language, we're always using language, so it's a meta-language about language. And that meta-language, especially when it comes to language acquisition and language repertoires, biologizes and naturalizes language in very, very strong ways. So when we talk about mother tongue, when we talk about native speaker, if you think about this, in many senses, these labels are absurd in some cases and not particularly helpful. So native speaker, nobody is born speaking, okay? When we're born, we don't speak, but we learn to speak soon after being born. But there isn't a language which we are born. We're born with a language faculty, unless there's something wrong with us, but we're not born with a language. Mother tongue, again, if you think about it, one mother, one language. That's the norm. That normativity is inscribed in that image. It's a fantastic phrase by Sheldon Pollock, scholar of Sanskrit, which I always quote, where he says, it's only in the modern national world, in the age of the nation, that the image of a mother tongue to be loved and never betrayed in all exclusivity becomes prevalent. And in Africa, of course, I get told something else. I say, well, yes, but in African kinship models, you can have more than one mother, because your mother's sisters are your mothers. Not in every kinship model, but in a number of kinship models. And so you can have more than one mother tongue. But it's not helpful to biologize it in that way, because it makes it absolutely normative. And anybody with more than one mother seems odd.
I just have a quick question. Going back to the native speakers, I feel like people have maybe, I don't want to say just people who speak one language, but just people in general. I feel like they have a very big misconception of a native speaker and a non-native speaker. Just speaking from personal experience, I speak, my native tongue is Macedonian.
Yep.
I came here at the age of 14. I learned English from when I was very little. Yep. And then I got my bachelor's in Spanish translation. So at my job right now, I'm a bilingual investigator, so when I say I'm a non-native speaker, and they say, but wait, hold on, let's get a native speaker. And then they get the native speaker, and the native speaker starts translating or attempts to translate these legal terms. And then they were like, wait, bring the one with the bachelor's degree. So I feel,
bring it back.
So I feel like there's always a very it's a strange misconception that people don't really understand. And also speaking from a point where I speak Macedonian, but if you ask me to write an essay in Macedonian,
yeah,
I would probably do really horrible at it, because I have no structure or base ground to do so. So.
Well, thank you for making yes. No, absolutely. I mean, again, and this is not, again, it's not about somehow, I don't know, demonizing the native speaker either, just like it's not about demonizing anybody who really, truly is monolingual and that they speak one language only. Although that language in turn will probably have different registers, different inflections. None of us speaks in the same way in every position in our lives. But you're right, I mean, effectively, what we're talking about is multilingual, polylingual, whatever you want to call it, repertoires. So, same with me. My Italian is better than my English in certain areas. But my English is far better than my Italian in some other areas. And then, my French is rusty, but I can do things in French in certain areas. But if you put me in other positions, I haven't got a clue, because I've never developed that particular area. It's about our competencies. But also, on top of that, there are professional competencies. There are the competencies that we acquire because we are language professionals. And so it's not sufficient to pluck the first native speaker from the street and say, come in here and translate, or come in here and teach, for that matter. Okay? But we wouldn't dream of doing that for certain other things, but we do that for language. Why? Because we believe that language is transparent, that somehow language is innate. And those labels, again, native speaker, mother tongue, do not help, because they reinforce that image, that naturalization of it.
And it's just adding, in my personal experience, I feel like I have more cultural language knowledge when it comes to Macedonian.
Yeah.
But more professional translation. I don't know how to word it, but professional knowledge, as in studying it from books. When it comes to translation.
No, but the perfect native, like in linguistics, the ideal, the notion of the ideal speaker. And the same goes with the native speaker. It's an ideal notion in a sense. The perfect native speaker is the same as the perfect ideal speaker. Someone who will know every single register and every single vocabulary area, etc., 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 and will never set a foot wrong. Such a mythical beast has never set foot on Earth. Okay.
I'm also reminded of the other huge contradiction in these days in the US with children who were brought here out of their own volition and are now without documents. And they're fluent in English, and they actually act as translators for their families. So they are the carriers of citizenship, if we will, right, in the sense that they know the legal system, they know the medical system, because they shuttle back and forth between their parents and the US, but they're not considered eligible to stay, right? So there are also all these other political aspects. I know there are more questions because this is an incredibly interesting topic, but I think we need to wrap up. You notice that Loredana is an extremely generous thinker and talker, so I'm sure that she will stick around a little bit longer. And in closing, I want to say two things. I want to tell you about a very interesting article that is available online in the New Yorker, and it's about polyglots. People sometimes your age who fall in love with languages to the point of becoming obsessed by them, so they end up speaking 22 or 30 or 50. It's a fascinating articles, and even though you may look at them as very, very, very different from us, I think the author of the article says something very interesting, so I wanted to read out this section of the article. The person he spends time with is called Rokas Bersha, and he goes around with him to understand how he functions when he learns new languages. And so he concludes, if the ultra-marathoner Dean Karnazes can run 350 miles without sleep, he may inspire you to jog around the block. If Rokas Bersha, the polyglot, can speak 22 languages, perhaps you can crank up your high school Spanish or bar mitzvah Hebrew, or learn enough of your grandma's Korean to understand her stories. Such is the promise of language learning programs, or obviously all kinds of other opportunities. In the brain of every monolingual, there is a dormant polyglot, a genie who with some brisk mental friction can be woken up. And so with that hope, especially from the perspective of language teachers, I want to invite you to our next programs. The next one will also be about language, and we're going to be talking about what we've been doing with languages in innovative ways. Again, in Italian, but it's a case, it's an opportunity. It can go indeed across languages. And then this is on November 15th, so join us to learn more about internships and summer courses. And then in December, we're gonna get into actually more of a dialect area, which is Sicilian, with a film called Sicilian Ghost Story. We're gonna have actually the director here and the protagonist of the film. So thank you so much for coming, for sharing so many thoughts and experiences. And thank you again to Loredana Polezzi for coming here. And